There's this interesting story developing where Venezuela, and by the way, if you haven't looked into Venezuela, it's interesting. It's very interesting because it was like less than 10 years ago that Sean Penn, Bernie Sanders. Oh, who's the director that did the movies about Hugo Chavez? Chris, can you look that up? Oliver Stone. There you go. Oliver Stone. Oliver Stone didn't just do one. He did two documentaries on Hugo Chavez and how Venezuela was the new model for socialism and how they were investing their natural resources and their government resources and the oil money that they received back into the economy and back into the people and back into social programs. And unless you've been living under a rock, Venezuela is effectively a failed state. And you can do a lot of reading on this. We'll actually link to a couple of YouTube videos that have like good 20 to 30 minute explanations about what went wrong with Venezuela. But the 60-second Reader's Digest that you need to know about is that Venezuela, more than Saudi Arabia, more than Iran, more than Iraq, more than the entire United States, even though it's a much smaller country than the United States, has more oil reserve in their ground than any other country in the world. Like Venezuela should be one of the wealthiest countries in the world. But what they did is, as the price of oil climbed over the last couple of decades, they made it a requirement that X amount of dollars per barrel of oil sold went back into the government, went back into social programs. And so what you ended up having is the oil industry, the effectively government-run oil industry, although there were some private entities in there, government-run oil industries, or this crony capitalism where they were kind of private companies, but they're really run by the government. As they're pulling oil out of the ground and the country is getting rich, they're diverting more and more of the profits or more of the income from this oil sale into social programs, right? And they're basically getting their entire society addicted to more and more free programs and socialist programs and free this and free that. And then, not surprisingly, because oil is a commodity and all commodities go up and down in value, when the price of oil drops, and it didn't even have to drop significantly. It's not like it had to crash. It just had to go down $10, $20 a barrel in oil. They quickly get into a situation where the government has mandated X amount of dollars per barrel have to come to the government or through the government for some type of social program. And now there's no money left over for like profit or actually the workers who are taking the money out or the oil out of the ground. And so what we end up having is Venezuela is effectively a failed state because it's gotten to the point where they can't even legally pump oil out of the ground at a price, or they can't sell the oil they pump out of the ground at a price high enough to pay for all the government required social programs. And so there's this really weird situation where Venezuela is importing oil from Iran because Iran's basically given them this favored nation status for other political reasons, and Iran trying to influence some country on the Americas or in the American continents. So Iran's bringing in oil to Venezuela, which is the most oil-rich country in the world. It's very, very weird. And unfortunately, the people that are suffering are the people of Venezuela, right? Like they got tricked. They got addicted to so many social programs and so much government spending that when that stopped, there was no other real private enterprise left in Venezuela. And there's just horrific stories of people like crossing the border just to try to bring toilet paper back illegally, and massive amount of citizens eating out of dumpsters and killing their dogs and cats for meat. And I think, Chris, maybe you can fact check this real quick. I think in the last 3 years, the average Venezuelan has lost something like 15 to 25 pounds because of malnutrition. And Venezuela apparently was not a morbidly obese country like America. So a lot of these people don't have weight to lose. But yeah, I think there's some stat that like the average Venezuelan has lost 15 pounds in the last year or 25 pounds in the last 3 years because there's just not enough food and nutrition in the country. What'd you find, Chris?
Child malnutrition rates increased by 26%, while general undernutrition rates increased by 21.2%.
Yeah, it's not good. Especially in a world economy where like one of our biggest problems in the world is obesity. Like for the first time in human history, we have such an abundance of food and such an abundance of cheap food for a country to not even be able to feed its children. You know, everything else has gone off the rails. But what's interesting is the U.S. was monitoring this Iranian warship that was maybe headed to Venezuela. And I've read a bunch about this story. And apparently there's this oil tanker that's been refitted as a Iranian kind of forward operating base. And for any of you that have been in the military, sometimes they call it the TOC, sometimes they call it the forward operating base for the AO, the area of operation. Sometimes it's like a big tank, where like all the commanders sit with their maps and their radios and they command the battlefield. Sometimes it's something bigger and more exotic. Sometimes it's a little traveling town. Sometimes, like in Iraq or Afghanistan, it becomes a whole base that's actually built out. And sometimes it's think battleships, right? It's this big ship where like everything is commanded and controlled from. And so Iran has one of these ships that basically houses special forces and advanced technology and radio. That's what they're presuming, obviously, because the U.S. has not seen the inside of the ship. So there was this Iranian frigate called the Makran, which is a former oil tanker that was converted into a floating forward staging base and was headed along the East Africa coast. They caught its trajectory on the ocean a couple times. It was headed to Venezuela. And then apparently behind the scenes, the U.S. started putting pressure on this. So it kind of like regained its original course, kind of just floating along the coast of Africa. And I bring this up not because I have anything really interesting to say about it, but it's interesting how this story has been developing, not really talked about in the news, between when I first read this original story, which came out June 30th. Again, it's now June. What's the date today? June 21st? 19th, June 19th. So this will come out in about a week, again, towards the end of June. And then this most recent story is from today, June 19th, so in about 2 or 3 weeks, it's changed course. And now it's kind of just circling the coast of Africa, maybe going to the Caribbean, maybe not. But I bring this up because this is really interesting, right? If you look geopolitically, we don't have a great relationship with Iran. Trump put a lot of sanctions on Iran. Israel continues to do kind of spot bombings, I guess it would be. Yeah, usually by plane against Iran. Iran's been trying to build a nuclear bomb for a long time, and then they say they don't, and then we put sanctions on them, and then it's a really ugly political situation with Iran. And Iran has said publicly, one, they want to wipe Israel off the map, so maybe reason we should side with Israel, not Iran. But two, they've really had this interest, this vested interest in having some type of foothold in the Americas. Obviously, North America, that's probably not going to work out. I don't think Canada is going to align with Iran sometime. But South America, whether you look back to the 80s with Grenada or Panama, or you look where we are today with Venezuela, every decade or so, there seems to be a failed state in Central or South America. And it would make sense for Iran either giving cheap oil to Venezuela or sending a warship like this, for some reasons that we don't know, over to Iran to help them with some type of command and control, or help their economy, or help their military keep down the rebellions and the revolutions that seem to be springing up there every couple of weeks. It's just very interesting that there's always these international politics at play. And again, I don't have anything particularly interesting to say about this. This is not my area of expertise, but it does remind me that when, myself included, many of us Americans spout off about something on social media of like, why didn't Trump do this? Why didn't Biden do that? Oh, he looked like an idiot saying this. Why do we have this policy? Why were there $200 million in the COVID bill that went to the Ukraine to build this up, to act as a buffer state with Russia? Just, there is so much stuff going on geopolitically, right? I would guess if you're one of our 2 listeners who have gotten this far, you probably have not heard about this Iranian warship that's going to Venezuela. And maybe you're not even particularly well informed about what's going on in Venezuela. But it is interesting to me. Like, I really try to be informed. I really try to consume a lot of information. And every day I just realize as I get older how much it is that I don't know. And so I would just say, kind of as a cautionary tale, if this story is interesting to you, or the Venezuela story is interesting to you, just remember, when you post on social media, or you start fighting with somebody in the comment section of the LA Times, or you start insulting Trump or Biden, or insert any other politician here or there, just remember, like, we probably don't know as much as we think we know, right? And there's probably a dozen people in the government somewhere monitoring just this situation, saying like, ooh, what could happen? Let's war game this out. Venezuela and Iran do become closer allies. Iran sends a warship to Venezuela. Why might they be doing this? What other public policy, what other commentary, the G7 conference just ended. What other policy at the G7 conference might want to be talking about? What sidebars does Biden need to have with Merkel, right? Or what is the stance that Biden has to take with Putin so that he doesn't align with Iran to have a foothold in Venezuela, which is, by modern travel standards, kind of just a hop, skip, and a jump jump away from California or Florida. So it's just, I just want people to be cognizant of like how much we don't know and how much is working behind the scenes. And yeah, it's fun to criticize politicians. I love posting memes about stupid Trump or stupid Biden, or I kind of hate them all. But just know that there's probably a lot of stuff going on behind the scenes that keep us safe at night that we just don't even know about.